I was very excited about this discussion on podcast because I'm a huge fan of podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time when I'm in my car, driving to see my kids. I have one son that lives 6 hours away, so I always listen to podcasts. I never even considered using podcasts in my classroom until I was listening to these podcasts and thinking about it and working on this discussion. And I just think there's so many benefits to integrating podcast into your classroom. One, there's just the benefit of having so many other educators that can give you ideas, that can even show a lesson to your classroom. It's almost as if we would have access to all these other educators to come in and teach lessons by just having a podcast and showing the kids and getting them excited about listening to this podcast. It's like having an extra instructor in your classroom. And I think the students would love to listen to podcasts because, one, I teach second grade and students just love technology. They love using technology. So I think there'd be a lot of benefits about integrating podcast instructionally into your lessons. Like I said, it just gives you a whole extra world of information and of lessons that you can teach and of different ways to teach them. And like I said, it's even like having educators come into your classroom when you're using the podcast. Some challenges with using podcast in your classroom. One of the main challenges for me would just be time. Time to research and find the good podcast that would be relevant to your lessons. I know when school is in session, educators just don't have that much time. And so it would have to be somebody that was very knowledgeable about podcast and that could, knew which podcast, because you would have to do a lot of research and listen to a lot of podcasts to find out. And it would be a lot of trial and error of, letting the kids, I think the kids would love this podcast, but then when you actually play it in the classroom, they might not be interested. So just the challenges of finding the good, relevant podcasts that are relevant to the content that you're teaching, and finding podcasts that would keep the students excited would be a challenge. Also, describe how the use of podcast influences student creativity, engagement, learning experience, and making meaning out of the content. That goes back to what I just said, just finding the correct podcast. If you can get the right podcast that the students like and that is relevant to the content, then it can really enhance your lesson. But just being able to search and find those podcasts is going to prove difficult, I know, for some educators. And like I said, it's going to be trial and error, finding the good podcast that the students would love to listen to, and then actually, playing it in class and seeing if they really do like it. That's going to be one of the things. But if you can align all the stars to work together, it would really enhance lessons. And I listened to the podcast, Podcast PD. I listened to one of their podcasts about ending the school year this year, and it was very interesting, and I did evaluate it on the Triple E framework, and it scored high as far as it kept me engaged. It was like 58 minutes long, and I just, it got me right in with the relevance of what they were talking about, how the school year ended, how it's going to look when the school year opens. That is something that all educators are wondering right now. And it was very interesting. So the time went by quickly when I was listening to it. And I think that's what would happen in the classroom if you got, a great podcast that is relevant to the lesson and that is so interesting. It just grabs the kids in. They would be so excited to use it. Just like I said, I didn't even realize that I had been sitting here for 53 minutes because I got so into the content that they were talking about on the podcast, and the relevance to my everyday life is what drew me in, because this is something that will affect me. So I got a high evaluation on this whenever I rated it, and it was all the way up in green as far as engagement and information and what I learned from it. So I'm very excited to even continue listening to this podcast. So I do believe that podcasts, when integrated correctly into the classroom, can really enhance the lesson. It's just going to be the point of finding the right podcast and making sure it is a benefit and doesn't take away from the lesson. That would be the challenge.